Hello and welcome to another Tech Talk Thursday. My name is Ray, and in today's video tutorial, I'm going to be guiding you on how to create a metadata-driven pipeline using Azure Synapse Analytics. This guide is going to be great for those of you just starting on your Azure Synapse journey and are curious how to load data from source to destination. This is also going to be great for those of you trying to understand basic Synapse pipelines concepts when it comes to loading large amounts of data very quickly. To begin, I want to start by showcasing the source data. This is an Azure SQL database housing freight data, and the objective that I've laid out is I want to move this data from Azure database to a data lake storage container. And in order for me to do that, I will need to create a list of these tables somewhere. Right? I could do it here on the SQL side, or I can do it using a control table on another instance of a server. Each of them have their pros and cons, each of them have their benefits. But for today's illustration, I've gone ahead and created a control table within a serverless pool that has the data that I'm looking to migrate over. So if I run this select statement, you'll see that I just captured some very basic information, such as the schema name and the table name of the data that I want to bring over. I'm going to copy that. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to move over to our Synapse workspace. And this is the Synapse service. Within the service itself, you can open up Synapse Studio. And as I open this, we're going to be greeted with a lot of icons here on the left. And the one that we're interested in to create our pipeline is going to be called Integrate. If I click on Integrate and click on the plus sign, I have this option to create my first pipeline. So here's where the pipeline is created. This is the template. I'm going to leave these names as default going forward. And in order for us to create a metadata-driven pipeline, we're going to need a few key pieces. And we're going to start with the lookup activity. This is the driver of the pipeline that's going to specify what tables that we want to iterate through within the list of tables that we want to bring over from source to destination. I'm going to go over into settings, and we're going to configure a data source, or data set rather. So I'm going to click on the new button here. And this is going to be asking me to create a data set from a source, from a linked service. So this is going to be, as I mentioned, this is coming from a serverless pool. So this will be Synapse Analytics. Now I've already configured my link service, but again, think of this as your server name, your credentials, in order to authenticate into the system that houses any type of data, right? So those of you coming from the SSIS world, think of this as a connection manager. It's asking me for a table name, which I'm going to leave blank because we're going to use a query. And now that I've specified my data set, you can see that I get a little bit more here in the UI. I'm going to say that we're looking to run a query, and I'm going to paste in what I've copied in my control table. So what this lookup activity will contain now is a list of items or a list of tables that I'm interested in migrating over. A couple of other things to pay attention to or take note of is this first rows only. If I only wanted to bring in the top record from my select statement, this would be enabled. However, because I want the entire list, I'm going to deselect that. And then what we're now going to do is move over to our next activity. So under activities, there is a iterations and conditions tab. And there is a for each activity that we're interested in bringing forward. And this for each activity is going to take the list from our lookup and do some activity inside of this activity. So I'm going to click in here, and we're going to need to do a little bit of configuration. So we're going to need to pass in the items from the lookup activity as I specified. And the way that we do that is under items. If we click in the text box, we're going to get a link to add dynamic contents. You can see that the outputs that we have available to us are coming from lookup one. So I'm going to click on this first one here. This is going to give me that output, but I need to specify the value that I'm going to want. So this is going to pass in that entire list into this for each loop activity. If I click OK, we can move on to the activities themselves. But I wanted to just touch really quickly on some of the settings here. So if I were to select sequential, the for each loop activity would run one at a time. However, if I leave this unselected, it will run in parallel. Also, I have the flexibility to run in batch. So if I wanted to run 5 at a time or 3 at a time, I could specify that here. I'm just going to leave these defaulted for now. If I move over to the Activities tab, this is where I can add the copy activity. This is what's going to move the data from source to destination. So I'm going to click on this pencil. And if I scroll up and go over to the Move and Transform, you're going to see that we have a copy data activity that we can leverage inside of our for each. This is also going to take a little bit of configuration. It's going to ask for our source and our destination. And these are going to be referenced, or these are going to be leverage data sets as well. And in order for us to make proper use of making this metadata driven, we do need to configure those data sets in a way that would enable us to iterate or accept multiple tables. So what I'm going to now do, before I get into too much detail with this copy activity, is I'm going to migrate over to those data sets that I've already configured. So if I go over to the data icon and I go under linked, you can see that here's where our data sets live. Oh, it doesn't look like I have one for the SQL database. So let's go ahead and create one. So if I go to source and I click on new and I look for SQL, you can see that we have the ability to create a SQL data set. And I'm going to select a linked service that again has already been created called Azure SQL DB. And this is going to contain a data set for me called Azure SQL Table 1. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see that it appears right here. So now within here, I'm going to want to do a little bit of configuration because remember, we don't want to feed it one table. We want to feed it multiple tables. You can see that it takes a schema name as well as a table name. And in order for us to pass in this information, we're going to need to set up a few parameters on this data set. So if I migrate over to the Parameters tab, that's what I can do. So I'm going to want to say that I want to pass in a schema name as well as a table name. And then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to ensure that this data set is wired up to accept those parameters. So by clicking Edit and then Dynamic Content, I can pass in the schema name as well as the table name. Click OK, and now my data set is configured for my source system. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the copy data activity. And now I'm going to select the data set that we just configured. And now you can see that it is expecting two parameters, right? It's expecting the schema name as well as the table name. And we're going to pass in the items from the lookup activity as parameters so that we can specify that this is the data that we're interested in extracting. So if I grab schema name, we can specify the attribute that is schema name, and then we can do the exact same thing for table name. So we can say table name. And now our source is configured to pass in these values that we're receiving from our lookup. And we're going to do somewhat of the same exercise with our destination or our sink. So I'm going to say new. Remember that this is coming from an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. I'm going to go ahead and click continue. I think the format that we're going to want these files to land in is Parquet. So I'll select the Parquet format. And again, because I already have the link service configured, I'm just going to select that. And where we're going to want this to land is in a container called raw and in a folder called Azure DB. And I'm going to click OK. Now, the only thing we have left to configure is what do we want these files to be called? Well, I'm just going to call them the table name. And again, for me to do that, I'm going to need to go to the data set and set that variable or set that parameter so that we can pass it into this data set. So I'm going to open up the data set. And from here, I'm going to navigate to the Parameters tab, click New, and I'm just going to call this file name. And now we're going to pass that into the file name text box here. And if I navigate back to my pipeline and to this data set, you can see that it's now appeared right here. Now again, in order for this to work correctly, we're going to need to pass in the item from the lookup activity. So here's my for each loop, call it items dot, in this case, it'll be the table name. And we're going to want to put in the proper extension, so I will use a concat function so that I can append the proper extension. So this will be .parquet. We can close and we are all set. Okay, so to recap, what we have done is we have created a lookup activity, which is going to pass in our tables to our for each loop activity. And then our for each loop activity will iterate through those tables, running a copy data activity to move the data from the SQL Server database over to the Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. And if I just navigate over to the data lake so you guys can see what the container currently holds. If I go to raw and I go into the folder, you can see that it's currently empty. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit debug, and this should execute. So we can see that we're running our lookup activity, and then we're running through our for each loop activity. And it's important to see that these are all running at the same time, right? We didn't batch, or we didn't say we want these to run in sequence. We are using parallelization to our benefit here. All right, we are now done. And now if I migrate over back to the data lake and refresh, you can see that we have successfully extracted our files from the SQL DB. And if I wanted to read this, another benefit of using Synapse is we have the ability to query the data here within the portal here. So if I go to the above tab here, you can see that we've already connected our data lake. If I go to that specified container, all I would need to do is right-click on the file, select top 100 rows, and using serverless, I can very easily see that I'm getting the data back. Here you can see that I'm looking at the items data, items.parquet file, and it is giving me the data that I've extracted from the SQL database. And that's going to do it for today's tutorial. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you learned something of value today. We'll see you in the next one.